Baby, when I met you, there was peace unknown. I set out to get you with a fine tooth comb. I was soft inside. There was something going on. You do something to me that I can't explain. Hold me closer and I feel no pain. Every beat of my heart, we got something going on. Oh, yeah. Tender love is blind. It requires a dedication. All this love, we feel no needs conversation. We ride it together. Uh huh. Making love with each other. Uh huh. It's in the stream. That is what we are. No one in between. How can we go wrong? Sail away with me to another place, and we rely on each other. Uh huh. From one cover to another. Uh huh. Does anyone remember that that cover song was covered by was it the guy from the Fugees who wasn't Wyclef? He had a song for the Bulworth soundtrack. Am I right? Does that make sense? Does that sound like anything? I'm gonna see if I can find the song I'm referring to. I think I might be right. Ghetto Superstar. That was it. Who did Ghetto Superstar though? Praz. And Praz was in the Fugees. Oh shit, I was right. But was it in the Boltworth soundtrack? Holy fuck, yes, it was. I remembered all of that correctly. Man, wow. That's what I've got in my head instead of anything remotely useful for any other human being. It's pretty funny. I sacrificed all of my hit points in every other category, and honestly, it was a very inefficient choice. Probably wouldn't do it again if I had the chance. But what are you gonna do? We are what we are, and I am min maxed to the hilt. All I can do is remember crap that happened. Have any actual skills? Okay, so today we're gonna finally reveal which China book we're gonna be doing. Now I gotta say, I feel a little bad about this because I realized after I asked people to like give me their recommendations that I actually already had a China book that I got on my Kindle a while ago. It had been recommended to me, I think, by Dan Denver, and so I was like, "Oh, I'll check this out." And it was short, and that really appealed to me. So it's like 100. It's like under 200 pages, I think. Uh, and I honestly think since I don't know that much to start off with about modern China, that going general and vague is probably for the best way to start. If we wanted to talk about something more specific, we could pull one of those longer works that people have been recommending to me. But anyway, this book is called The China Boom: Why China Will Not Rule the World. So spoiler alert there for all the people who've been asking, will China take over for the United States as the new global hegemon? The book seems to be arguing will not. I tend to agree. I tend to think that whatever comes after American hegemony will be post hegemonic, and so China will it will not it will not. recenter the global supply chain. It will instead be one of those structures that exists to administer crisis capitalism after the breakdown of the political, technological, and logistical supply chains that make modern world capitalism possible. So that means China is every country for themselves. So China is not going to come to the rescue. I think that's what people kind of wonder when they say like, "Will China take over?" They imagine, "Will China rescue us?" Like we see the coming conflict with China basically the same way with that the right and liberals do, which is this an inevitable conflict. The only difference is we think they're the good guys, right? It's like no, this is just like what Steve Bannon and Joe Biden say. China is on a collision course with the United States. The question is, who should we be rooting for? And this book seems to be arguing, and we'll see as we read it, they're not going to be in a position to make that kind of play. They're going to be too busy keeping themselves on top of the increasingly teetering social structures that are going to come under deeper and deeper um, crisis. Crisis is the name of the game. I mean, capitalism is always in crisis. I would argue, actually, uh, that class society is always in crisis because of the inherent conflict between classes that drives everything. And I do believe that Marx, this is I think this is the central insight of Marx. It's the atomic it's the splitting of the atom that makes everything else make sense because all of a sudden stuff that had been processed by the Enlightenment in one context uh, can be looked at from an angle and notice, oh, all this stuff that you're claiming is inherent in human history, inherent to the to human animal. Uh, all that stuff is generated by the fact that somebody is working for somebody else, and that puts a dagger in the heart of social solidarity, and that rift has to be managed, and that is the crisis that defines all class society. And the way that it produces crisis is that it always must seek to expand to accompany for the fact that its internal structure is being eroded. Like conquest is what maintains these power regimes because over time they become stagnant and lead to a revolt. It is social pressure. This is like the magma coming up through the tectonic plates, and it has to be managed. And that everything that we think of, religious, culturally, social, all of our values, our notions of language and nation, identity itself, are premised on structures that grow out of the need to manage these crises. And what keeps final crisis at bay is expansion. And the history of society, history of settled human agricultural hierarchical societies that emerged. We've talked about how this happened with the Graham Grow book. I think that it is very much a thing. You had a relatively harmonious social structure where, because of the superfluidity of land relative to humans, allowed people to really resist any real authority. Nobody could actually make anybody do anything for a sustained period of time. You could conquer somebody and kill them or something. You could kick them off land, but you could not make them like maintain a regime of subservience because they could just go somewhere else. And I think that, and because they had the ability, like these are people who had, um, these are people who lived like in close relationship to their environment, gained their food not through abstract actions that then are given like a value form, but by their own hand. And they could always feed themselves on the land as well as the, it's better to be together in groups for some reasons, but it's not essential. and that was an equilibrium. Like that's going to create society. It's going to create culture, but it's not going to produce what we think of as society because it does not leave the same structural remnants, the ornamental features of society in which some people are sitting around while other people are doing work. And that is what means, that's what we, when looking back on the historical record, that is what we see as civilization. And it emerges exactly when settled agricultural social structures emerge. We can talk about why that specifically happened. I think Gravegrow actually traced it out perfectly correctly. It's just they don't see the implications of what they have sketched out. What they sketch out is the notion that so you have these people living in there's conflict within them, of course, they're humans, but it is not a class conflict because there's not a felt class distinction. Then more people show up. People start moving around. They start bumping into each other. The best land gets taken. The best place for humans to thrive are found. The place where you can get the most back for the least work, which is what people are looking for. We all want to work less for our survival because why work more? We don't have a weird religious structure around work the way that you do have to have in class society, where it is like a ritual inscription. It's just stuff we all do. So why would you want to do more of it? So the lowland places, the places by where you could do agriculture without planting, you could just throw some seeds down, and then the rising river tides or would come in and irrigate it for you. You wouldn't need to use any. You wouldn't have to build a fucking windmill or have aqueducts or shit, and you wouldn't even have to, as I said, plant. You could just leave the fucking seeds, and then boom, you have a supplement to a diet. But then enough people show up, and oh, you got to work a little harder. You're motivated now because your social group, to maintain its cohesion, has to work a little harder. And that means more unpleasant labor, more stuff that sucks to do. Well, how do you determine who is going to do it? And this is the where we create the rituals of the ritual religious uh, uh, world wherein our labors have an abstract relationship. They render us subservient to some uh, totalizing uh, other that we are worshipful of. A god. God is co-internus with us. Now, the people who there's God everywhere. Every God is inherent in every system. It's just how it's translated from the people within it. And for them, they had a God, but it was not this abstracted principle that people had to bring themselves subservient to. And that is why you see that so many of these agricultural regimes are brought into being through mass ritual bloodshed. This is especially true in China. The basis of agricultural society in China were these early societies that were carrying out massive, almost industrial scale um, sacrifices of enemy captives in war, and that inscribed this hierarchy. That blood it sanctified everyone's place in society, and that allows class society to continue because now that contradiction between one class and the other it has been obfuscated. It has been broken up because now you have God in there vindicating their place in society, making them necessarily seek value in the work they do, and therefore inscribing it with meaning because they have to, because they're now being compelled, but they still have, this divines that they want to connect to, so they have to do something. The thing they do has to mean something, and that is what everybody seeks under class society. Is the best thing is to be able to do work that means something and it does not is not at someone else's direction. But a class society needs that, and conflict between class societies is what sharpens it. And how did it start? Before you got there, you had, according to Grabgrove, you had proto-egalitarian societies in the Mesopotamian Valley. You also had hunter-gatherer societies that did like feasting cycles, and where they would build temporary hierarchies, but then would disperse into total egalitarian lifestyles outside of those time frames when it was basically a played at, ritualized sense of identity because the stakes were not there because class conflict did not define those societies. And what they did is they created this first bureaucratic state where, the fucking cuneiform was invented to figure out how to distribute communal products. The giant warehouses were the centers of these cities, and within them you see the cataloging of these mass-produced items of life, like olive oil and wheat and shit, to be distributed, and you don't see the sort of priestly palaces and vast displays of ornamental wealth either. And so that becomes a stable equilibrium. But here's the thing: everybody who encounters this world is now encountering a world where they have to resolve the conflict between their own individual sense of self and conception of the world, way of being, and the one imposed, the one that we all have to agree to when you have a society. And that the people who are going to get pushed out, and again, there's still enough room that even though there's now greater concentrations in these more desirable areas, the more arid, the more difficult to live in areas are still available if you don't like what's going on in these early egalitarian urban areas. Who gets pushed out? Chads. People who want to uh, young men mostly who want to assert their will in the world due to their fucking testosterone. Let's boil it down to that. Like the surge within the male of these species towards a will to power, the grasping of it, that is something that is deeper, you could argue, than class conflict. Because now we're talking about the individual's subjective experience of the world and the fact that there's a world outside that we're all creating through mutual collaboration. And the thing that makes you want to collaborate, what's wrong? Oh shit, is my audio not correctly plugged in? What's Does that sound better? Ah shit. Well, I don't know. I don't know. I got this thing plugged in. Reverb. I don't know. I don't know how that. Fuck. God damn it. This sucks. I don't know how to check the. I'll just unplug this thing and plug it back in. What about this? Can you hear that? Is it better over the? Is this better? I'm just doing it through the. Worse? Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Well, congratulations. I have absolutely no idea what the fuck I was talking about. Thank you very much. I have no idea what I was talking about. Fuck, god damn it. Whatever. So that you're going to have in one of these egalitarian unsettled societies, those guys, they can submit themselves to the ritualized state that these societies had, right? On a seasonal level, like you come together for the fair, and then you've got cops, you've got games, war, that kind of stuff, and it gets that energy out somewhere. It blows off the steam. Uh, And then you can go back and live, as bands and not submit to anybody's authority because there's so much land that nobody has to fight, really. Especially since those rituals create this kin relationship. You might stumble onto somebody else's area, but you're part of the same kin group. Like they talk about how in early American societies, you had these clan systems that didn't correspond to geography. They were spread throughout entire regions because you would have people all over the place claiming the same symbols. And where do those symbols gain meaning? In these ritualized structures of state. But once you get settled, there's no place for it. There's not, if there's not war with an external enemy, what are you supposed to do with that energy? And you can do sports, but for some people, it's not going to be enough. And so, what's going to be created as an antithesis to the thesis here emerging of okay, we have to have some sort of extractive relationship to our environment and some sort of hierarchical distribution of labor because that is key here. You cannot you in order to compete with other social formations doing the same thing. Settled society means not only are you doing more labor, but that labor will be unequally distributed because it's the only way to. Um, it's the only way to gain the value add of like it being a social product. So you see settling in the hinterlands uh, a different culture, a a warrior culture, a culture around going out and fighting other groups of young men. And the societies that emerge out of that, the Kurgan societies that have been theorized, end up just steamrolling the early, the early kind of quasi-anarchist uh, uh, city states, and then they take them over and then dominate them from the top. And that's where you see in early Mesopotamian society the shift from these big communal warehouses and like minimal pageantry and ornament to this massively ornamental military dictatorship, which happens when the guys out fighting each other, some of the ones who do the best live the longest. They gather around them the most followers. They procreate. I mean, you literally create this genetic this evolutionary hothouse. The way the finches' beaks start changing within a few generations in the Galapagos. And then then as soon as those regimes take power, now you have the thesis that has now emerged, which is these social structures and notions of work and responsibility and religious life that had been kindled in a kind of pre-class society where like social hierarchy existed, but it did not confer social status. And then, and that is when the people who the steppe people, the people who go out to stay in conflict with the world and with each other, they're going to always come back and jack your shit, which is what undermines the entire stupid thesis of stupid grave grows stupid book. They make this beautiful argument that I think really helped me get my head around a lot of like how human history is evolved. It's been tremendously helpful. I'm really glad I read it. But they point out that this order existed before the imposition of class society. Therefore, we can do anything we want. And it's like, no, man, as soon as those societies became uh, complex enough, and over time, complexity is going to emerge. You can't stop that with all of your anarchism because size is going to continue. Populations are going to grow. Demands on resources are going to grow, which means the amount of effort, labor that the human body is going to have to do to extract more calories from the world as more people are born into it. That's the challenge of getting a social human animal in homeostatic relationship with its environment. And class society, once it emerges, drives a stake into its own heart because in order to operate, It has to assume the conditions that it was generated under. Like, if we do this, we get this amount of tribute that fuels our system, that lubricates the gears, that keeps it going and growing. But as time goes on, because you're just sublimating your destroying your environment to eat up the consumption of more and more people, and that is putting social pressure. How do we keep in competition with each other? Because here's the thing: we are the social animal, but we are divided into tribes, groups along those symbols that have helped us learn why it is good to work. You know, why it is good to be obligated to your fellow man. Like a vocabulary of like deep religious truth, and that is grafted on top of a religious system that instead codifies class rule, and and what that means is that as your relationship to the environment destabilizes over time, because right, you're extracting X every year, right? But Y is going away. It's being destroyed in the process. Yes, there is some regeneration, but over time, this is just basic Malthusianism, but it's true. Over time, you outstrip your environment. And then you can solve that. If you don't want to change how your system works, you can solve that by getting more, deepening exploitation, deepening the amount of labor people have to do, forcing them to do more labor. And this is how you get slave societies. Oh, here are people who we don't have to treat like people. And that supercharges your ability to extract and therefore compete with other social formations. But the whole time, this machine is running on borrowed time because eventually any system reaches uh, its extent, its ability. Because at this point, we're talking about discrete social formations like empires occupying specific geographic areas and being bound by them. And they reach a certain point where they can no longer expand because there are other powers there around them that are closer, more concentrated, closer to their own supply lines and base of power, that they can resist your overthrow or they can resist your reach. You cannot extend it beyond that geographic center, be it Rome or Istanbul or Beijing or whatever. And when they reach that point, it's only a matter of time. There's gonna be more droughts. There's gonna be more famine. There's gonna be plagues now because you've got people living next to animals and generating diseases that are gonna fucking run through your population. Now that's has one effect. Hey, it's cutting down that population growth, but it's also undermining the structural integrity of the institutions, ideological, cultural, technological, that actually make the thing run. The actual like skeleton of it, the muscle, not the superstructure shit. And because you live in the superstructure, where your reality is our system is just because it is in harmony with God, which is the basic underlying premise, unstated but expressed different ways culturally. Secular, religious, it's all the same. It could be communism, it could be American exceptionalism, or fucking political Islam. It's the same idea that our way of being is in correspondence with God's will. And that is expressed through nature, has been since the Reformation. And it goes for every post-religious secular person and every communist and everybody is operating on that assumption. And so if the system itself is destroying its ability to maintain itself, well then you've committed blasphemy in your heart, and it's very hard to do that. The whole system exists for you to never have that question brought. That is what ideology does. But it also is torn away by circumstance. As the destabilization increases, that is when class the the reality of class rule becomes more apparent. If you start exploiting the slaves too much, or even while you're exploiting them, you're getting less out of them, and therefore the structures that hold them, like the knives at their back, the rows of military that is a state expense, is no longer affordable, and all of a sudden cracks can begin to show. Or conflict between elites for the scraps leaves everybody to not even being paying attention, and then not even noticing what the slaves are doing. That's the good. Haiti is a good example for that. Yes, of course. I'm saying all modern. This is what I'm saying. All modern famines are man-made. Going every class society famine is man-made, in the sense that it is in conditions of unstable relationship with the environment, because you can't move. You cannot accommodate changes in weather in a specific place. You can't all just sort of get out of the way of Mother Nature's fickle whims. You're planted, you're set up, and that means that when the food goes away, you're going to have to mostly stay there and to try to extract more from it. And some of you are going to die. And who's going to die most? Those at the bottom, because they have the least power. But those are some of the things that over time eat away at the legitimacy of your state. And then it collapses. And now we're in the first time in human history where there is no exterior thing that we're bumping against. Like up until you could argue 1991, capitalism is still bumping against something else. The same way that the Qing dynasty uh, bumped up against Mongolia, and even could bump against England and the United States and France. There's nothing to bump against. It is a global system. So the crises we're seeing are ones that cannot be resolved by a collapse that is then to the benefit of all those neighboring states, right? Like a collapse leads to local power being maintained, because at the local level, people are self sufficient enough to keep their heads and keep their social structure. Like the collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, is really the collapse of a trade network. The local centers of power basically stayed intact. Some cities got ravaged by the Goths or something, but for the most part, those Germanic tribes just became the new tributary warlords of a system that was still basically intact, at least in southern Europe. Like one of the big cultural conflicts that you see emerge in medieval Europe is between those areas that maintained relatively robust social structures after the collapse of the Roman Empire, like southern France and northern Italy, versus the more feral northern sector, including, of course, England, where the collapse of Roman power was essentially overnight and total, as opposed to the much more gradual process that was, in some places, basically undetectable, that you saw in southern Europe. And I honestly think you could trace the conflict in France, the conflict between uh, the different parts of the French lands that ended up being knit into one thing. The South, which was the South, which was the headquarters of the Albigensians, the Cathars, who were one of the first big heretical sects of medieval Christianity. The first crusade ever declared was against the Albigensians. They were massacred. Famously, when the cardinal sent his troops in to massacre the final holdouts, he said, "Kill them all. God will know His own," which is the first "kill them all, God sort them out" thing. Uh, and so you had more of a trade society versus northern France, where you had this very quick reemergence of like warlord military rulers who just imposed this purely extractive relationship with subsistence and surplus farmers, and then that carries on into modern European or modern French history. But anyway, this is all to say, uh, it's this. medium state conflict, these more and more powerful, more and more technologically innovative, more and more advanced societies banging into each other in a search to stabilize the crisis ridden heart of their system by extracting more because it's all they can do. And our crisis feels different and is different to the extent that we are getting these first real uh, cracks in the foundation emerging. Now, again, they were there the whole time. They're always there in every system. The question is, to what degree are the crises ameliorated by the continued horizon of more profits? We use technology to increase productivity. We use international law to create the most highly arbitraged and socially efficient manufacturing system, where where people who make stuff get paid basically nothing, so and then people at the other end can consume stuff. But even with that, over time, it breaks up, and the cracks started really accelerating almost immediately. It's wild. Like Marx is often made fun of for saying that there was going to be a like while he was writing in his he honestly thought in his lifetime, but certainly very close to it, there was going to be a final world crisis capitalist, a world final crisis and infinite capitalism, where capitalism goes into final death spiral. It's crisis ridden heart pumping beyond its capacity and then giving out. But the thing is, first of all, I think it is very interesting that Marx, like Christ, spoke and wrote as though he believed that the millennium would happen in their lifetime. And I think that any real prophet thinks that way. Because why else would you be so fired with prophecy? You know? Like there has to be a personal stake, an imaginative stake, to keep you invested. If you're that kind of a soul, if you're that much of a mind on fire genius, as like Jesus Christ or Karl Marx. But he was right. World War One, I would say the second 30 Years War. Again, we'll be talking next year, early next year, about the first 30 Years War. Very excited about that. But we had the second 30 Years War as the capstone to capitalism in crisis. Just as the first 30 Years War had been the capstone to terminal feudalism. Feudalism was in terminal crisis. It had been this hybrid dog creature, this inefficient junk wreck for hundreds of years after the Black Death. Basically saved it from having to confront its contradictions. Because, oh yeah, this population problem we have where we can no longer get any more agricultural productivity out of the land than we have. We had get no more uh, coins. We can get no more gold out of the earth to create specie to circulate an economy. What are we going to do? Oh, thank you, plague ships. Burp. Like, this is why the conspiratorial view of history can sometimes be misleading. When you look at how beneficial to the capitalists, and there were capitalists who lived in high medieval Europe, because all these systems are studded with each other. There's never just one thing. It's just what's the dominant paradigm. And feudalism had been broken up and replaced by this tenant farming system in most of Western Europe, but serfdom was reimposed in Eastern Europe. Why? Because there was more fucking land. And it limped along. And it started to break up. Its internal structures couldn't hold anymore. The Reformation is a part of this. The structures of medieval society, of medieval life, the pace of the medieval life was not consummate with what it felt like to actually live in this more and more commercialized society. More and more commercialized, more and more abstracted society. People living in a system that had been designed for the medieval pace of life. I should say feudal pace of life, because this is no longer feudalism. But feudalism is still the overarching political structure. And so there's this massive conflagration, the 30 Years' War, and its attendant crises, the fucking revolution in England, and all the revolts in Naples and France, the Fronde, and fucking Spain. This massive paroxysm. What emerges out of it is capitalism, that it breaks the feudal hold. That 17th century is when the chrysalis breaks away and falls away to reveal the new synthesized capitalism, synthesized on a religion, on a basis of Protestant religion. I know that Catholicism stuck around, but it was on the losing team. It would not shape the future definition of things. Protestantism would shape the future definition of things. Why? Because Northern Europe was speeding up faster than Southern Europe. And why? Because Northern Europe was more fucking environmentally unstable and prone to famine and starvation, more scarce. That definition, that different speed of life is because of scarcity. Increased scarcity in Northern Europe led to more uh, abstracted regimes of exploitation, technologically in the creation of a market space where you could, instead of having to ritualize socially the violence of exploitation, which is inefficient, you put it off onto a market. So it doesn't have to be socially costed. But we can all pretend it's not being created by the system we live in. So that means that they're actually stacking up uh, surpluses in the form of cash and then in the form of abstract instruments of credit. That's a huge thing. And it's all part and parcel to the personalized God of Protestantism that allows. Shit. Sorry, I gotta put this in. Okay. You hear me? Okay. Okay, good. What the fuck was I saying? So capitalism sets up shop there, and it of course takes 100 or so years to achieve hegemony through the instruments, first of the Dutch Republic and then the British Empire. And it completes that job by the mid 19th century. That's when you see things like the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom in uh, China and the Civil War in the United States. That's why you see the fucking 48 revolutions before that. This is the moment. When Marx was there, it was the eschaton of global capitalism, not yet as one as a global system, but as a system that could compete with other systems, and and a rate vastly more efficient than any of them, and it would force all of their competing states, all of them, to adopt their policies. That is the moment that Marx was there for. And Marx saw at that rate, even with colonial exploitation, the competition between the states of Europe as they grew in power and grew in technological sophistication and immiseration at the heart of their systems as they have to create more and more proletarians to work in more and more exploitative conditions to fuel the system, they will come to conflict because the boom and bust will eventually become unstabilizing. And he was correct. Like he died in what 1881, I think, or 1888, I believe. And by 1914, like, and if he'd kept a little better care of himself, he might have made it to that old, you know. Uh, but then he wouldn't have been him, you know. If he's out walking around, he's not sitting in the British Museum archives. But anyway, uh, he could have been alive for that. That's within a realistic lifespan. He would have been an old man, but he could have seen it. Uh, and 1914 was it. It was the start of this 30-year paroxysm as capitalism, as soon as it takes power, within 50 years, comes to fatal conflict. But the reason that was not the end of capitalism is because by this point, capitalism had made all these other social formations into mirrors of itself in order to compete with them, which means that you now have capitalisms outside of Europe. Now, Europe is where it was born, and Marx couldn't see this because he was a European at the end of the day, and he couldn't see really, he didn't really, how could he grasp beyond that? Like, he could read a lot about the United States, but he never lived here. So he didn't know what was happening here. He didn't realize the extent to which the United States was absorbing all the social contradictions of European capitalism and resolving them through the distribution of free real estate and the exploitation of, skin color slave labor, racial caste, and manifest destiny. These are the missing ingredients that European capitalism could not provide to the center. And that means that these Europe can knock themselves out, but when it's all over, here is this new headquarters to take over from England and take us to a stage that Marx I don't think ever imagined possible. I mean, I think he did in the long run, but he had always assumed that it would be interrupted before that could occur by the internal contradictions of capitalism undermining it, which it did. Those contradictions were not felt the same way in the United States. And the United States, by that point, was able to marshal a continent's worth of resources and therefore be in a material level able to take on the role of Europe because of their relatively similar economic power within the global system, which is mostly filled with um, decaying imperial systems in the old imperial parts of the world. The parts where there was no small state competition because there was a central imperial authority. And what made that happen, according to Wolfgang or Walter Scheidel, and I agree with him, it was the proximity to steppe nomads. The Chad's Chad, the society that even after everything else got settled, even after the warrior kings came back and dominated the city, so they could sit fat and happy and decadent in their sedan chairs, they stayed out there. They fucking they grabbed horses and they fucking domesticated them, and then they just fed them on endless grass fields and just lived as warriors. And that threat kept the Chinese, for example, always focused on a emergency level crisis of imminent annihilation, which meant that all you could have. That meant, for one thing, no feudalism. Feudalism was abolished in China in, I believe, the 200s AD, like after the consolidation of the first empire, or after I think the fall of like the first dynasty, 200 BC. They're like, yeah, no, these fucking dickheads having like sovereignty over their territory in exchange for military on their terms, military uh, uh, service. We're not going to keep the Mongols away with that bullshit. Get out of here. Whereas nobody can dominate anybody else like that in Europe. Nobody can take over everybody's place. You know, they can come in, they can fight you, they can ravage your territory, but you're still going to be in charge unless you die on the battlefield, and that's a glorious death. You're not going to be uh, not going to be exterminated as a social fiction, which is what uh, a barbarian society operating literally by different rules because of their different relationship to their environment, their different production method, or their different mode of production. Their different their like their means of production were the weapons of war and their horses because their all of their efforts went into being best at fighting. So that means they could go to a place where people had built stuff and just take it. I'm talking to the Scheidel book is Escape from Rome, a very very good book. I highly recommend. Um, but the stability led to stagnation, as someone says in the comments, because there is nothing harnessing all of these ingenious innovations that come when more and more minds are working, more brains are together. They're closer to, they're able to communicate closer because you get like everything, printing revolution, you're increasing mind power. But that mind power gets dissipated in a system where a central authority can prevent certain innovations from flourishing because they rightly see them as threatening. In Europe, everybody was going to grab what they could get. And what they grabbed was the financial innovations tied to religious innovations that sanctified life in a godless world, basically, that took God out of the world, as in the market, made the market made the market that is the world, our social world, a desacralized space, and to bring all religious uh, conception internally. I am the God. Of course, they would never have said that, but no, that is what they did. Instead of saying, I am embedded in a social organism that is God, I am God. And then there is the social, which is not. It is a nature where we can do whatever we want and we can treat our fellow human as bad as we want to because it is God's will. Because if it's doing me good and I'm God, then I willed it. And of course, for those people who things aren't going good for, tough shit. You're not one of us. You're a loser. You fall out of real existence. The book, again, for next week, thank you for reminding me, is The China Boom Why China Will Not Rule the World by Ho-fung. This guy's name. I wanted to do something by an actual Chinese person. I'm already a dang gaijin or whatever. Is there a Chinese word? Is there a Chinese derogatory? Because gaijin is Japanese. Is there a Chinese derogatory term for round-eyed foreigners? Baizu? Guilo? I'm getting I'm getting Guilo and Baizu. I got three Guilos now. Now I got a Baizu. It is neck and neck. I'm getting a Baizu for every Guilo. Means devil man. That's awesome. Yeah, it is kind of wild. Like think this is the thing that I find very interesting about contemporary Asia is that you had these societies like the Japanese and the Chinese who, for very good reason, believe themselves to be the center of the world. Like it was not obviously everybody thinks that they are the center of the world, but they had the best case. They certainly had a better case than anybody in fucking Europe, the ass end of the continent. I mean, it wasn't as barren and resourceless as a lot of people like to claim, but compared to life in China, it was nothing. One of the big reasons that the Chinese never really did conquest, exploration, is because they didn't need anything. They didn't need fucking spices. And they had trade networks that allowed them to sell the stuff they did have for stuff that they wanted. And a huge chunk, a huge amount of the silver that was pulled out of the South American mines by the Habsburgs went to China for silk. The Middle East also has a very good claim to it, also because of its geographical, literal centrality to that whole area, that whole nexus there. Um, and so their religion reflected that. Like their folk notions of religion that like turned into, like that's what's so fascinating about China specifically. It's like you have this central imperial authority, but then at the folk level, you have basically a totally a profusion of totally unorganized local folk beliefs. Like you've got Confucianism, you've got Buddhism and Taoism. They're all there, but they're just very loose, like rubrics for grouping together what are essentially local spiritual phenomena. And I think those things go together. Like in the West, those military states coming out of the collapsing Roman Empire require a social dimension of coercion that the Chinese system didn't need to because uh, it was a lightly felt hand basically at every point. Um, but all of these religions had in common though is the Chinese people were God, the people of God, whatever you meant by that. Just as the Japanese Shinto traditions and Japanese Buddhism too, they were the centers, and that meant that the Weibos, the Gaijins, these are devil people. These are people who are not of God, like the same way the Europeans thought of the infidel other. But in their case, these highly developed social formations that were just as abstract, just as everybody in them was living in basically the same mental universe of mastery of abstract concepts, uh, have just these devil people show up and then take them, destroy them. It's very easy to see how the samurai were broken in Japan because how could anybody believe in the old gods of favor when these fucking gringos are showing up in their white ships or black ships and be like, hey, stand and deliver. Oh man, what if the Romans had discovered fossil fuels? Holy shit. See, the thing is, you can't get it because those those sort of innovations come from basically bottlenecks of capital emerging. You're getting like concentrations of money around and focus and human attention around a specific problem. And those only occur if the social structure is facilitating that. Like the state is intervening on behalf of these things. And that is like England. One of the big things that makes them the place where the Industrial Revolution happened. Because yes, they took over from the Dutch as like the commercial headquarters of European capitalism in the late 17th century. But they were not able to. What made them dominate everybody else in the next 200 years was the fact that they took those resources and directed them towards these industrial questions that were then that the society existed like the liberal marketized society they had allowed for those efforts to get immediate reward in the form of patents and money, incentivizing the best minds to get to this specific question. Because otherwise, everyone's going to be going towards their own drummer. We're going to get somewhere, but it's not going to be efficient. What capitalism does is it allows the state to say, put money here, put money here, put money here, towards the creation of specific technological breakthroughs in order to compete more effectively. And the British Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, is tied directly to the British war effort during the Napoleonic Wars. It was it was fighting Napoleon that gave the British political system sufficient incentive to facilitate, deregulate, subsidize the construction of technology, first of war, but then, of course, other applications around war. But war is like the health of the state. War is what makes the state, and then the state makes war, as Charles Tilley says. That's correct. But every time it does so, it creates greater and greater technology, which then is directed to the common use under capitalism by being privatized. Now, this is social. This is a social product, but it is privatized because of our fantasy ritual world that we live in. Was consecrated really in the Roman ethos. Like Capitalism is just the Roman conception of right property, the Roman world, the Roman I. Among all the competing social structures that existed at that point, the Romans were the first to codify the the values of a society, in the conditions of crisis capitalism, or I'm sorry, crisis class rule in Europe. And it is the European geography that makes it unconquerable after Rome falls. But Rome's operating system, basically, is never overthrown. It is incorporated. The texts of the Renaissance, the church maintains the structure that exists of the Roman Empire. The church hierarchy is where the Roman Empire retreats, basically, and then like military authority is devolved to warlord chieftains, Lombards, and fucking Franks, who then organize into social structures dominated from the middle that can extend their power as far as possible. And so you get the Holy Roman Empire, which almost immediately breaks into pieces because the German part can't hold because it is geographically too unbound. It's unbound the way that France is bound as shit. They call it the hexagon. It has five almost perfect natural borders, like either rivers or oceans or the Pyrenees. And just like Iberia is a fucking peninsula, Italy's a peninsula. England is an island. Germany is just this. It's this river. It's these river systems. It's these civilizations dotted along the Rhine or the Danube. It cannot be taken from a middle like that France can be from Paris or England can be from London. To this day, you go to Germany, there's no big city. There is no. You might think Berlin is like London. Berlin has like 2 million people in it. London has like what 30 million, something insane. Somebody tell me how many people are in London. I think it's got to be like 20 million at this point. There are 2 million people in Berlin, but there's like 2 million people in Frankfurt, and there's a million people in Munich, and there's like 5 million people in Hamburg, which is why Ohio is the Germany of the United States, because Ohio does not have one big city like Milwaukee or Chicago. It has Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and then it's like even second-run cities like Akron and Toledo, which are like Dusseldorf, and yeah, it's a bunch of Milwaukee's. Or I guess Cleveland's. That is the thing that's annoying though, is because Wisconsin should be the Germany of the United States. It's got, I would argue, it's the most German influenced state. Uh, and I think the fact that they had the socialist mayors, that they were able to actually take power municipally, is proof of that. Because that was the current of German emigre life. The people who left Germany did so because capitalism had fucked them raw. And so they came to America and tried to set it right instead of just trying to make it on their own, like every other fucking card sharp Irishman who came to these shores. Okay, 14 million people in the London metro area. Still, not as many as I thought, but nonetheless, only 2 million in Berlin. But sadly, Wisconsin just has the Milwaukee. It's got Madison, but like just the shape of Ohio's even kind of shaped like Germany. 6 million metro in Berlin. That's $10 million, 4 million. And so that's the machine that took over the world and we're at the end of it. Our simulated computer world that is supported not by uh, any kind of ritually consecrated human endeavor, but by the unthinking, totally alienated, unconnected to human life cold decisions of algorithms. Ah, the sound is fucked. God damn. I really felt like I was on a roll here, but all right, I'm gonna just avoid whatever. I'm fine. But now we're in a situation where there is nobody else to pick up the slack. And I think what happens then is we look backward and we're like, okay, yes, we can say that we have a globalized capitalism. But as I said before, every system has embedded within it remnants, undigested remnants of what came before. So, like there were capitalists in the Roman Empire, even though there wasn't capitalism. There were capitalists in every society. There was proto capitalism in the the Muslim world in the Middle Ages. And also, once capitalism emerges, those old systems still remain in some remnant form. Like there's still artisans out there, and so that means that if the supply chain breaks the way the Romans did, we're left with the same thing that was the Romans were left with. Local power persists, but at the edges, it frays into essentially lawlessness in some respect. And so we go back to the Roman imperial system with localized trading routes protected by local structures of power that are then going to negotiate through these whoever is able to command these out the well, that's the thing, that's the difference. So after the Roman Empire collapsed, right, you had the local trade networks, the local power structures existed in the cities in the south, and then it collapsed more fully in the north, which is where the military aristocracy evolves to fight other people for land rather than to cultivate and trade it the way that they were doing in the places that had kept things. And they eventually overthrew and dominated and created feudalism, which is, in a respect, is a progress from the slave society that preceded it. Because hey, at least it's not slaves. They don't own your person. You are required to give them labor as tributary relationship. So if we take that analogy to the current moment, who is going to be uh, that force outside? Uh, and here's the most pressing question: has technology progressed so much since that time that the walls of the trade networks are going to be essentially impregnable? And so you will have people fighting for the scraps in the exclusion zones where the trade networks break down and where capital retreats, does a tactical retreat to maintain resources elsewhere. The social base for this thing is going to be decaying rapidly. People are going to be getting spit out the bottom like nobody's business. But much of its operation will be automated. Drones, cameras, Boston Dynamics robots, simple geography, proximity, the creation of inaccessible atolls of wealth that then direct the remaining people who are getting just enough to stay on the treadmill. Man, somebody's asking if me and Chris would go to any raves or festivals this coming year. Chris and his wife Molly are big time ravers and festival heads. They're music heads par excellence, and I respect them and their beliefs very much. But I am not much of one of those kind. Standing up that long is a hassle. My back hurts. I get sweaty. But we did go to the club. We went to like the club type scenario in Miami, and that was very fun. So I'd be willing to go. I'd be willing to try out a fest. I mean, we did go to Pitchfork or not Pitchfork, Pickathon, and that was great. I don't know if I could handle a rave though. Seems really loud. Yeah, we went to Club Space. It's called. It was weird. It was called Club Space, but it had sort of like a autumnal like forest vibe. I don't know if that was for Halloween or something, but it felt like we were in like the Ewok village or something. And I was like, why is it called Club Space? Maybe that's it. Maybe it's the Ewok village in space. Yeah, I would need earplugs. I only got one ear, so I have to protect it. I don't know if anybody knows that I'm half deaf. I have to say though, being half deaf, that's one of those situations where uh, it really is. It seems like it's all or nothing because I technically cannot hear at all out of one of my ears, which means I'm half deaf. But man, I still can hear a lot of stuff. And when I see deaf people, it's like, damn, they can't hear anything, and I can still hear a lot of stuff. 50%, it's okay. But I do think eventually those batteries are going to run out. The robots are going to get tired of chasing around in a circle, and then whatever people have done to survive in that exclusion zone is going to become a stable, uh, viable social formation, and it will eventually be able to push open those gates, unplug the dumbass corpses from the computers from these idiots who like tried to plug themselves. At the end of it, it'll be armies of human liberation marching into deserted uh, compounds and finding some rich dickhead who looks like fucking King Tut, shriveled ass, like with like a fucking like a USB cord coming out of his spinal column, and into like a fucking MacBook. And you open the computer and there's just like an 8-bit guy just going blorp, blorp, blorp. And the hope in every human breast that has to be there, is that those people will be able to synthesize everything that had come before them as those people before them did, but having come to this point where conceptions of humanity extend to all of humans. I know we like to think that, oh, everyone's racist now and fascism's back and nationalism is horrible, but the violence of those systems is a rebellion against the deeper truth that cannot be renounced, which is, oh shit, we are all one thing. Fuck. But so, class society can't have that, so it has to be suppressed. I mean, I don't have to sell you on the future thing. It's going to happen or not. You have to make decisions about what you're going to do with it. And maybe they don't. Maybe they don't figure it out. Maybe they're worse. Maybe they're worse than everybody. And then they dig up the nukes and they destroy Earth completely. Okay. Still, 100,000 years in the future after that, 200,000. Got some fucking. That's right. Some fucking squid guys. Some fucking squid creatures who have come to land and are able to use their encounters with our artifacts to harness technology to the social being, to negate the cancerous uh, conflict based uh, algorithm at the center of our social identities that's been passed down since the fucking Romans. All right, I think that was good. I've gone pretty long. So next week we're gonna read the first half of the China Boom. It's like 60 pages. It's nothing. It goes through like everything until 2000. So I'm expecting a very breezy jaunt through the political economy of early modern China, which is exactly what I want, as I said. If there's something really interesting specifically I want to get more into, uh, find another book. But I think this is a good entry point. The book is The China Boom: Why China Will Not Rule the World by Ho-fung, Hung, I believe. What's his name? Ho-fung Hung. That's it. All right. Talk to y'all on the flippity flop.